This episode brought to you by
GTM AI Academy. Learn AI from a globally trusted resource. Coach K, Jonathan Carfort. Their bundle, Enablement AI Mastery, includes both the core Generative AI Foundations course and Enablement AI Mastery specifically. Each course has a value of $599 individually, but Coach K is offering them as a bundle with reduced pricing. And as a listener of the Inside Sales Enablement podcast, if you act now, you can use code ISE30 to get an additional 30% off of the entire thing. You will also receive free access to the GTM AI Tools demo library. Coach K has done the demos, so you don't have to, and offers his straight shooting opinion, fact-based through an enablement lens. Go to www.gtmaiacademy.com and enter code ISE30 today and elevate your AI enablement game.
Welcome to the Inside Sales Enablement Podcast. Where has the profession been? Where is it now? And where is it heading? What does it mean to you, your company, other functions, the market? Find out here. Join the founding father of the sales enablement profession, Scott Santucci, and trailblazer Brian Lambert as they take you behind the scenes of the birth of an industry. The Inside Sales Enablement Podcast starts now.
I'm Scott Santucci.
I'm Brian Lambert, and we are the Sales Enablement Insiders. Our podcast is for sales enablement leaders looking to elevate their function, expand their sphere of influence, and increase the span of control within their companies.
Together, Brian and I have worked on over 100 different kinds of sales enablement initiatives as analysts, consultants, or practitioners. We've learned the hard way. We just did in our pre-work here, because this is a re-recording of a previous one. We've learned the hard way of what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, ask us about it sometime. It was an interesting warm-up to this call, and I think you guys are in for a real treat because we're going to be talking about analysis versus synthesis. As a sales enablement leader, you're an orchestrator, and perspectives matter. And one of the things we're focused on here in Season 2 is understanding different perspectives, and more importantly, bringing people together to move forward to help clarify measures of success, provide examples of what it means to blend strategy and execution together to drive results, and really gain the confidence to have more meaningful conversations in and among those people responsible for helping sales be successful. And as you guys know, we usually start with a centering story. So Scott, take it away. What kind of story do you have for us today?
What we're going to have to do is go way back. Normally we start our stories in the 1800s or something like that. So we're going to go way back. And we're going to go way back to as early as 391 BC. That's 391 BC. That's where we're starting our story from.
All right, great. Wow.
And what we're talking about is something called the Attilan farce. The Attilan farce.
The what? Attilan farce.
Attilan farce. And basically what the Attilan farce is, it's a style of theater that the Romans invented. And if you kind of go way back in, think about Greek mythology and all those weird Greek plays that they did with their lyles and, all the stabbings and the Greek tragedy that always end up so depressed. The Romans, of course, ripped that off because a lot of Romans ripped off Greek culture. And they were doing those Greek tragedies too. But the Romans, it was too heavy. Like how many plays can you watch where everybody dies at the end? So what happened is, if you kind of can picture this, if you know like acting, and they have those masks, and they have the frowny mask and the big smiley mask with the heavy accentuated facial expressions. Those come from the Greek model. So you would act with these masks on.
Yeah, you put them in front of your face and be like,
Yep.
I'm happy now.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah,
So
I remember that.
that's what acting was. I guess they didn't trust the craft and they had to have tools. Right. Acting enablement, Greek style 101. Okay. So now we're fast forward to it. So you do that. But what happened is in this town of Attila, not Attila the Huns, that's different. In the Roman Empire, what they really started doing is something different. And after the heavy main event, the actors would get on and sort of riff. They would play on redoing that whole play, but they'd redo it comedic, and hence the idea of a farce. In no time, that became wildly popular. So it spread. And what that really is it's really the genesis of something called improvisation. So let's fast forward to the 50s. Improvisation got a renewed interest in the United States, particularly in Chicago. And in 1959, the Second City formed. And you might be aware of the Second City. A lot of famous actors that we know about that are really funny, like John Candy, people like that, Jim Belushi, came out of the Second City. And the Second City really experimented with a lot of rules around how to do improvisation, which seems really interesting, right? Improvisation seems like it's free-flowing and the like, but really to make that form work, there's a whole slew of rules that you need to learn. And what's been very interesting now is that form is moving into movies and TV. So if you've ever seen a show like Seinfeld or
Saturday Night Live,
Curb Your Enthusiasm,
mm-hmm.
Saturday Night Live is more scripted than that. But what Larry David and Seinfeld is, they would etch out like scenes, and then they would ask the actors to sort of play off on each other.
Oh, right. Yep.
So that's what makes those shows about nothing something about something. So what's interesting is it's really disruptive. It's disruptive to a lot of people. It's disruptive to the actors that you bring in. And that's really what our centering story here is, going all the way back to ancient Roman times, of pivoting from just doing a play a certain way to doing a farce.
So what
does this have to do with sales enablement?
So what? So let's break it down for everybody listening. So one thing that's changed is that the playbook that we've all run, here's the product, train the salespeople on the product, go sell the product. Sort of the same classic, the analogy being the same as the Greek play, doesn't work anymore. And so we're all learning a form of improvisation as we're trying to work backwards from customers. So that's one thing. The second thing, though, is it's really difficult to learn how to do that when we know only the rules of being very specific actors. I have studied my lines.
I'm classically trained.
Right.
Yeah.
And there are certain rules of stage rules to go through. And when you start changing the rules to do something different, it causes a lot of people to go batshit crazy. And then another variable that's relevant here is I hope our listeners have heard of design thinking. Design thinking is a technique that's being that's gaining more and more traction, and it's an approach to tackling complex human-based systems to come up with some innovative solutions for it. And in order to do design thinking, the number one rule is to moving away from analysis and concentrate more on synthesis. So the reason that we're having this conversation here is that the nucleus, many of us are really, really, really wired to analyze things 80 ways to Sunday. If you want to understand that, just ask us about what our first take was on this podcast. But it's just very easy to get caught up into, well, we have to know everything there is to know with everything before we start doing. But unfortunately, today we don't have the time to do that. So joining us today is Brooke Spatz, and Brooke Spatz is best known. She's involved in the Sales Enablement Society. She's best known for her work at Omnitrax. Brooke and I have worked a lot in implementing the Rouse to Value program at Omnitrax. So we have a lot of sweat equity, don't we, Brooke, about how it is to introduce something new that may sound simple, but sometimes simple isn't easy. So, Brooke, would you want to introduce yourself to Insider Nation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Brian, for having me on. We're talking about one of the topics that are near and dear to my heart. And in addition to Scott's intro, just to add a little color, I've been in the sales enablement space for about, 20 years or so now, in some capacity of sales, marketing, product marketing roles, but always leaning toward more of an enablement focus. And one of the biggest things to me, and what I'm really, really passionate about, are the we've been talking a lot on about these words. The 4 words that are always overarching for me are collaboration, problem solving, empathy, and awareness. And so this topic of improv, and I love the grounding story, Scott. It got me so excited thinking about, I have so many thoughts about what happened, why they decided we don't like this anymore. We want to change. Was it influence from just what they thought, or was it the audience, or both?
Brooke, have you ever seen a Greek tragedy?
Have I ever seen a Greek tragedy?
I think all it would take was one viewing of that and say, I'm done.
Yeah, they're miserable. And the masks, we see that iconic image of the 2 masks together, I think, for your listeners, the comedy and drama, and the antithesis between the two, if you will. I mean, they're so opposite, and that spawned somewhere. And I actually did not know the full story like you just told it. I find it so interesting that what they were doing was taking what they had just done and almost replaying it in a different way. And we love doing that, don't we, Scott? Through these engagements we've worked on together, we love it. So
you're an actress too. You have an acting background.
I do have an acting background, yes, and it's,
how's that helped you in sales enablement?
Practice, but it certainly doesn't leave you, right? It's all the world's a stage, if you will.
Well, here's what we do. So Brian asked you, how's that help you in sales enablement? I'm going to ask everybody to go search her on IMDb. And then go find that video, because it is hysterical.
I wasn't going to do that, but Scott did.
Yeah, did you? If you want, I can speak to that for another moment, as far as where I think it really translates in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to hear that.
Years for me, and in the roles that I've held. I listed those words, especially empathy and awareness. And with, some of the formal and just experiential training I had in acting, and, from a very young age, it very quickly you realize the need to have empathy that is putting yourself in your audience shoes and knowing your audience, and also being able to almost, see yourself and through someone else's eyes while you're doing all these other things. So it definitely, helped with the L&D background that I have with training. I love being up in front of folks and getting, facilitating, et cetera. But you could do that and not be really effective with it because you're not necessarily engaging the audience. And so, that training helped me tremendously with the empathy aspect and knowing and being able to walk in someone else's shoes very, very quickly. And, I continue to apply a lot of those concepts with everything that we do today. Always trying to empathize with clients, always, when we're in workshops, trying to develop things, trying to have empathy, both for really everyone involved. And I just think acting helps with that.
Absolutely. That's a great story. And it really relates to our centering story. So that's awesome. And we'll keep bringing it back, figuring out if we have a Greek tragedy or not. I'm trying to get that out of my head right now. But But this is great. So the reason why you're on this call with us, this podcast, Brooke, is we've been talking about analysis and synthesis for a while, but also the recent episode that we had with Doug Clower, which was episode 45, the modern day Marco Polo, where Scott was Marco Polo, and you'd reached out to me, and I just would love to have our listeners hear from you what struck you about that episode, and perhaps how it relates a little bit to analysis versus synthesis or improv.
Gosh, yeah. So I reached out to you almost immediately after I listened to that particular podcast, and there were several things that stood out to me. Of course, if you listen to it again, I forget exactly where the timestamp was, but the topic of walking in another's shoes was brought up by Doug and Scott and yourself. And, throughout that podcast, you started talking about, some ideas toward the end, and Doug told the story about having, I believe it was either a CFO or somebody in the financial type role in the company he was with at the time, to put together a presentation about how the company made money. And that just hit me so hard. I thought it was just awesome, because we think so much about the things that, kind of at this top level of what we have to roll out and how we check that box. And a lot of times we forget that there's a fundamental baseline of knowledge that, as simple as it may seem, we may be missing translating that or communicating that to the audience. And I just thought that was so neat. And one of the other things that really stood out to me was the point made about the merging of two things, which is strategy and tactics. And that sounds cool. Sounds like something you should be able to do. Yeah, we should do that. But the actual execution of trying to do that is a completely different story. And so I found myself asking, wow, that's a really cool idea. How do we do that? How do you do that effectively? And of course, with everything that we're circling around today between synthesis and analysis, it all links together, right? I mean, in order to sort of marry those two concepts of strategy and tactics, what do you guys call it? Stratacution? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
There has to be a blend of these types of thinking and approaching problem solving.
Yeah, that's great. And that episode with Doug and what you're bringing up here, I'm gonna kind of play off of. I'm gonna do some improv and play off of you with where you're going here. The interesting thing about where that discussion came from was this Venn diagram that Scott had shown in his one of his webinars in the state of sales enablement, and the overlapping Venn diagram was with a circle of strategy and the circle of tactics, and where those overlapped was stratacution, as you just mentioned. That creates a space in between or an overlapping space. And the more I've worked in sales enablement, I realize that those two circles are very, very overlapped, not just a little bit overlapped, but overlapped a lot. And the more successful enablement professionals that understand that, we call them orchestrators, and that's who's listening to our show, they operate in that space. And one of the things here that I'm building off of is the concept of improv, the concept of creating space for the farce to happen in the first place, to try something new, the idea of creating space when you walk in somebody else's shoes, the idea of creating space to understand both strategy and tactics, right? That idea of space is something that I think Doug resonated with, that I resonate with, and I would just love to hear what your take is with regard to being creative or improvising and the concept of space. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think one of the most challenging, or one of the things we sort of have to ask ourselves when we think about that space, as you're describing it, is, am I comfortable or uncomfortable in a place of almost ambiguity, if you will? If I don't know what the end picture looks like, am I comfortable? And if I'm not, how can I get comfortable? Because that is what we're talking about when you feel like you need to know what the end picture like. You tend to block the creativity that can come out of this, we're saying improv right now, or the design thinking aspect of, creatively solving problems and working together to do that.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you can have space in a meeting, right, where you have a bunch of different perspectives. You could have overlapping space there of thoughts and ideas and design thinking techniques, but you can also have some space on a blank sheet of paper. And I've seen people actually struggle with, I call it, blank sheet itis. It's a blank sheet of paper. I know I need to produce something. I'm a knowledge worker.
What am I supposed to do with this?
Yeah, it's what am I supposed to do on this blank? I need a template, or I need something to start with. I'm even seeing, I don't know if that relates or not, but that jumps into my head. You can actually have space on a sheet of paper too.
Well, no, I agree with that too, because that I'm very familiar with that feeling. We all have it happen. And a lot of times the less of a template or the less of an idea or vision you have, I shouldn't say vision, because I think that part, let's set that aside for a minute. I think it's finding comfort with that blank piece of paper. And instead of panicking about, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do here, because what we tend to do is worry about getting things wrong, and I know Scott is really passionate about this, because he's yelled at me a couple of times
in a nice way.
Just do it.
He's been
in a very nice way, but don't worry about it. Just do it. You're not going to get it wrong. It's like, but exactly what is it that you want? We all fall into that, and rising above that fear, if you will, and feeling really confident within that space is a goal that I think is really worth focusing on in order to be an orchestrator.
Yeah, and I think the role that Scott plays as a catalyst in that is critical. And I've been on the receiving end of that, and I actually appreciate it, the next day or even the next minute, because so sometimes that's what you need. You're looking at the blank sheet and you just need to start typing, or you need to engage in discussion.
It's interesting. It's not so much in the moment, though. And I think that's what I want to give some clarity here for is to do something big, you have to be able to do something small. And some of it has to check your own biases. And it's one of those things where you can go and tackle something really, really huge. Like, Brooke and I worked on a major transformation project at our company. And it starts out, you got to do some really tiny things that are very, very uncomfortable. And most people are unwilling to do those uncomfortable things. So if you're not going to do it, no one else is going to do it. So that's really what I love about this idea about synthesis versus analysis. What do we know for sure? We know for sure with everything that we've learned in business is to analyze things 80 ways to Sunday. I want to report. I want to look at the data. But what we know for sure is things get connected by people and through making the space work. And there's no one person who can look at a set of data and say, here's the answer, because you're going to interpret it differently. So part of what was interesting about this exercise for our listeners, I challenged Brooke and Brian. Brian loves analysis. I love synthesis. So part of it is we've got a little bit of an oddball couple going on. I said, here's what would be awesome. What if we were to work with Brooke? Let's get you guys to work together on the difference between analysis and synthesis, but really let's understand why this is such a big deal. It's such a big deal because we don't even have the vocabulary to do all of the things that we need to do all the dot connecting to make things work. And if we're going to be orchestrators, we've got to learn some new rules. And then we have to introduce new rules to people, because as we try to infect other people with our positivity and our awesomeness, they got to have the right rules. Yeah. And if they don't know the rules to engage, they're going to go back to the old rules, and we've got a Greek tragedy in our hands instead of a fun farce.
Yeah, and I've seen that at a very human level as we look at people engaging in something new, transformation or rollout or just a pilot even. And let's keep it simple for our listeners. We've got this concept of space. We're in the space. We're probably in the space a little bit now, and you guys are like, get to the point or whatever. And we're creating the space on purpose in this podcast. And we're gonna say, look, there's primarily two reactions to that space that we see. on one hand, you've got the folks that say, I already know what to do in that space. I'm going to get at it. I'm going to engage. I've seen it before. I'm going to look for cause and effect. I'm going to look at the past, and I'm going to project the future, and I'm going to take action. I'm going to do. And so we're going to call that the analysis side. And I'm not trying to sell that short. I'm just trying to keep us moving in and say there's a response that you can take to say I'm going to analyze. There's another one that's around, okay, I'm in the space. What's possible here? What can I do? What's needed for the organization? What's available? How do we get creative? And how do we get multiple perspectives in here to bring things together, to innovate or to create something new? Instead of saying, I already know what to do, it's, I wonder what we can do, and it's what's possible. And that's the other side, which is synthesis. So we're going to frame out and breathe some life into these concepts of analysis and synthesis today. And then you get to decide really about what your take is on that. Certainly we're going to have a point of view on it. And let's talk that through. But, Brooke, what's your reaction to kind of those two buckets of a response to space? What do you think?
Well, I think that if we relate it back to sales enablement and where we are today and what a lot of us experience, we've probably all been in situations where we are being asked to do a million different things. And we're trying to move fast and we're trying to deliver deliverables. And getting finding the space in between execution and strategy can be very difficult if you're not purposeful about it. And Scott, you were spot on when you said, the rules and process. I find it really fascinating. The improv analogy is perfect because why do we love improv? I mean, most of us do. We love watching actors just kind of think on their feet and deliver something awesome. What we don't always realize is behind the scenes, there is a process and there are rules of engagement.
Yes.
And the more successful deliveries you see, the best ones, the most epic, I could think of 3 or 4 examples.
Like what? Like what are some of the unwritten rules that I wouldn't know about, for example?
Just think, the rules. Yeah. A big one is Scott, you were mentioning it, adding new information, focusing on and when we compare the analysis mindset, which is looking at the past and the things that this is what we've done, this is how it's always worked, versus the synthesis of creating something new, of bringing those parts together and creating something new, that's looking to the future. And that can feel like it's slowing things down, which is a lot of, but it's so incredibly necessary. And in the end, it speeds things up, and the end result is so much better.
Yeah.
So, things like adding new information, not blocking. You never want to block another. If you and I, Brian, are improving, which we basically are doing right now, you don't want to block the other person's thought process or their flow. And we talked about this one off the podcast for a few minutes, but the idea of asking questions during an improv is actually frowned upon because it can break the flow as well. Instead, you want to try to be present in the moment and be focusing on specifics and adding more details and bringing things in to add color.
Exactly, like I'm going to do right now.
Go for it.
To add to what Brooks what Brooks is talking about is think about a situation where you're doing a training environment and somebody disrupts the role play because they say my client's never going to do this. That's an example. Mm-hmm. Another example, Brian, is I know we've heard me talk about yes and. Part of what you want to do is if Brooke is talking and I'd say, everything I heard what you said, that's great, but, and that we're really used to saying that, what I've just done is I've negated everything that she said. And now I'm imposing my rightness on. If I say yes and, then I can build on off it. And my job in improv is to always move it forward. And you have to do it instantaneously. So other rules are you have to trust people, but you have to pay attention not on what you're going to say. You have to pay attention to what the other person is saying. So you have to really listen very, very carefully. So you have to develop completely different listening skills. And my job is to make Brooke look better by my ad, not me. And if you're going to take the ball, your job is to build on what I said, and so on and so forth. That's how you get that positive energy and positive momentum. But you can see in that chain how easy it is for somebody to break it.
Yes. And
there you go. See, exactly, just there.
in a business setting, we've practiced recently. I've been practicing the yes and so much more because we talk about it so much, and you're great at it, Scott. And it's just one little addition. It makes a profound impact on
really
communication. And I encourage everyone to try it. It's pretty impactful.
Yeah, and I think when you look at that, you can get into a state of flow. And one of the things, or two of the things that I think that I've seen that can really throw a wrench into things. One is obviously taking the opposite of what you guys just said, but I think there's this concept of time, and Brooke, you alluded to it. Well, we don't have time for that, or I already know the answer, so why don't we just and jump to that answer.
Yeah.
Do those violate the rules of improv and synthesis? Those two things, or are those frowned upon? Like, why are they so prevalent? Because those are real barriers that I've seen.
They definitely are. I think it is definitely overarching, and most of us experience it, and it's also self-driven, because I think it in part at least has to do with setting expectations and putting that process in place and following that process, whatever that is, the rules of engagement. And if you and your team have those rules in place, or that model in place, then you're less reactionary, and you tend to be less pressured by a lot of times external sources of imposed timeframes. And it just, I think, has everything to do with setting those expectations up front. Yeah. And they have to be carefully, meticulously put together, as a mission statement, and, as part of your, I'm going to steal from Scott, as part of your operating model, right?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, I love, Scott. What's your take on that? I mean, do you think if I were to inject and say, well, we only have an hour, let's get this done, do you think that's an analysis frame or a synthesis frame? You think it's analysis?
Yes. But what it is, you're imposing an element of control, rather than letting the flow happen. That's definitely one thing. And you're bringing your own anxiety, your own goals into it. I think for me to piggyback on what Brooke was saying, the best analogy that I have is it's like a tennis match. And the people who are doing synthesis or synthesizing are actually playing the match. They're actually literally back and forth, doing the tennis match. And the people who are analyzing are sitting in the stands watching the tennis match. And the reason that I think that getting into this flow and improv is so important, and that you need to do it in your team, is because our salespeople are dealing with it on a daily basis. They don't get the time to analyze a bunch of stuff. We want them to be analyzing a bunch of things to check boxes and fill in information. They don't have that luxury when they get on a call with or have a face-to-face with a client. They need to be able to put things in front of that customer to get them to react. And then they have to be able to listen to what's happening in the moment and be able to anticipate where it goes from there, but allow the conversation to flow. And I think one of the things that's valuable about improv and this whole idea of synthesis and analysis is it's a completely different way of working. It doesn't replace one. We still need to analyze. It's just don't let the analysis just choke out the synthesis, because the synthesis is where you do all the dot connecting.
Yeah. And so let's draw a little bit of a compare and contrast, because I really want to breathe. I mean, if I would put myself in the listener's shoes, I'd obviously synthesis we would be leaning towards, just because of the COVID era innovation. It's a word that says and screams digital economy. However, the reality of most companies is that they're in an analysis-driven culture with a lot of data and a lot of numbers. I'd like to just, kind of go through a bit of a compare and contrast here to draw a bit of a distinction and draw a wedge between these. Not saying one's better or worse than the other, but just making sure we're clear on what these are. For example, analysis, we've talked about data, rear view mirror, said Brooke, task, attention to detail. And I think the impact of an analysis type of mindset or an approach is maybe, looking at what happened in the past and being able to show what's happened through data or something like that. Whereas synthesis is more focusing on bringing things together, riffing off of or building off of others, combining things, putting things together. And really, Scott, you and I have talked about this. It's this idea of let's try to infer and build insights on what's going to happen in the future or what's happening right now, like today. So what's you guys' reaction to those types of criteria, if you will? And do you want to add anything else to those to help our listeners understand that there is a difference between the two?
I'll take that for a minute. I think that I think it's really important to first ground it in both are necessary, and that we're not saying that one is better than the other. I think both analysis and synthesis are necessary to get to that outcome, whatever it is. And that being said, it's the balance between them and understanding the lists you just gave were great, Brian, because what we want to first do is be aware of those. Those indicators, if you will, of where we are and how we're processing things and how we are thinking. And so I think one of the most fun examples to me of a great combination between synthesis and analysis is the Food Network show Chopped. And I think a lot of your listeners, most people are familiar with it. But if you think about that, the process that those contestants go through, and from the opening of the basket to the figuring out what they're going to cook, and when they figure out what that end thing they're trying to put together, what it's going to look like, the most successful contestants, and usually the ones who win, are a great example of the perfect blend between synthesis and analysis, because they're able to analyze the ingredients they have in front of them and apply past knowledge to what they are and what they can do, and then have the synthesizing capability to very quickly on their feet come up with an innovative solution to blend those many, many times very disparate ingredients that make no sense together on paper into something awesome.
Yeah, I love that. And I think you can do that in a moment in time. And I've also seen synthesis over a long period of time, hundreds, if not thousands of little touch points over time, yielding something different because people paid attention and they understand what's happening at a micro scale. And then they're able to infer what to do in the macro. Scott, I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I'd love to hear from you as well on, especially on Brooke's comments of both are required. And your take on it in that regard.
So I want to address it. I want to make 2 points. So point number one is, as a listener, synthesis is a concept that's going to seem very vague. And what you're probably going to do is you're going to apply the lens that which is to analyze it. And that makes it even further reachable from you the harder you try to analyze it. So I think the first thing to think about is they're just two different levers. And I'm going to be sciencey. Brooke, you love it when I get sciencey. But let's get a little sciencey. To draw some contrast, if you are being a biologist and you're observing how things work, you're making observations and synthesizing information because you're going to have to put it together. Now, on the other hand, if you wanted to take all those, that same person and measure growth charts and things like that, you're analyzing. One is good for one kind of decision-making. One is good for a different kind of decision-making. Now, let's bring this to life here of why this distinction is important. All of us are familiar with a boatload of data that we can collect about salespeople. How much data do you guys track inside your companies, right? How much do you track about whether they're consuming this asset or that asset, whether they've taken this course or how long they've been in this course, or whether they're at quota or not at quota or anything like that? Does any of that information help you figure out whether a salesperson's good or not? All it does is it's measuring things. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't do it, but what you can find out is whether or not a salesperson has the ability to connect the dots with lots of information and put it into a way that's understandable for a customer. And that's synthesis. So the challenge that we have are we have to figure out in this world that we're living in is how do we toggle between these two things and recognize a lot of us are going to be super comfortable with analysis because that's something that we could put on a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint and we can show our box is checked and we can get people off our back, but does it solve any problems? So yeah. I think these are the contrasts that are important.
Yeah, your example. Oh, sorry, Brian.
No, go ahead.
Or I got excited because.
No, go for it. Yes, and Brooke.
Yes, and. Scott, you're absolutely so spot on with that example, because that is exactly what we do. Is we have two sides of the coin to look at. We have all this data, and all these numbers, and can we really glean the information that we need in order to help those people, those sellers, to become, better versions of themselves and what they want to be and be more successful, et cetera, et cetera. And I tend to be in that particular example. And over the years, I have always leaned more toward the synthesis side of that, because I have found that just, simply observing a live, conversation and riding the field, or, nowadays being, hopping on a call and being there as a fly on the wall, even in the right context, that I'm here to not to judge you by any stretch. I'm here to just observe, to see what our clients are, what you're going through, sales rep, and what our clients are talking about, and to help be a connector between that information that's being shared as much as possible. And every time for me, in my experience, it has been so much more effective to look at it through that lens in order to execute the kinds of things later on down the road that we try to.
Yeah.
Enablers, right?
Yeah. And this is a great point. And what it brings to mind is, I just kind of did a little bit, let me dump this out and see what you guys think. So Scott, you're talking about the data level, right? And synthesizing there to infer, we're hearing a lot about collaboration, diversity, et cetera. You can synthesize at the people level around projects and initiatives. So bringing different perspectives together. As orchestrators, we're going to have to do that. So this idea of finding patterns or communicating among people, et cetera, is going to require some synthesis activities or mindset or approaches, especially, for example, this improv analogy. And then we've got the department synthesis. So the commercial ratio, Scott, that you've been talking about at commercialratio.com, you guys can check that out. But that's a roll up, if you will, or a synthesis of the commercial engine. And if you think about all of the moving parts of that in sales and marketing, that's a measure of those things coming together. I'll even go so far as to say the company synthesis through merger acquisition and what that could look like. And then where I wanted to go was with this buildup is at a profession level. A story that I would like to share is I read a book by Franz Johansson from Harvard, and he actually has a book called The Medici Effect. And one of our podcasts, Scott, we had a cultural synthesis with the Renaissance and Marco Polo in episode 45 that Brooke was talking about. So that's a cultural synthesis at the crossroads there in Italy. But one of those things that was interesting was there was a guy who studied bugs, an entomologist, and he understood how termites in the desert kept their termite mound cool. And for some reason, he geeked out on that, got a degree in that, and he loved it. But then he switched to engineering. And there was a bid that came out from one of the governments, and they wanted to build a office building in the desert. And they were looking for a cost-effective way to do that. And what he did was he basically built the building like a termite mound. And the way that termite mounds keep cool is they build tunnels underground, and they line it with water, and then they build a shaft in the middle so the hot air rises, and the hot air goes out the top and sucks in water or air in the bottom that runs through water, which is exactly how an air conditioner works. So using the synthesis of these two fields of entomology and engineering, he was able to build an office building based on termite mound principles. And any innovation today, to me, that's achieving some sort of breakthrough is the synthesis of something with another thing, including fusion food, which I love. So I'm just kind of inventorying all these transformative things that have happened. And it's not because somebody analyzed it to death. It's because, to me, they've synthesized something with something else. What do you guys think of that? Any other stories come to mind?
Well, I'll go. So I think that works. I think if we were to, put these into buckets, you're going to first, there's the synthesis that you do as an individual. So, Brian's example, that's, I don't want to say an academic example. It's a big brained example. Then you can go all the way down to an example of doing your job or training a salesperson. I think the first thing is to get comfortable with what synthesis is, make it relatable to you first. It's got to be you first. Then the next thing is you have to understand it well enough because you're going to need to work in a team and you want to introduce some of those rules. And I'll tell you, one rule to always introduce is yes and. If there's one rule to implement on a team, it's yes and. Mm-hmm. The other thing, the second rule that if you could introduce would be learn how to give constructive positive feedback instead of, because we know how to give constructive negative feedback and focus on problems. What we don't know how to do is envision what the future is going to look like. So I think part of what you're talking about, Brian, is I think like to make this idea land, is this touchy-feely? Is this squishy? What the heck does this have to do with my job? How does this have to do with collaboration? I think step number one is you have to recognize you do this to do your job. Because no one in sales enablement that still has a job isn't synthesizing. But you got to recognize when you're synthesizing and when you're analyzing. Because it's so easy to get caught up around the axle and try to apply analysis to work that requires synthesis and vice versa. You get zero stuff done. So I think the first step is you've got to make it relatable to yourself. Then you have to figure out specific applications of it. Then you have to really stress yourself on how do you talk about it with other people, because you can't, it's just almost impossible to synthesize by yourself. So I'm going to throw that. I'm throwing the proverbial wand, the hot potato to Brooke.
Yeah. Brooke, you get the last word, and then I'll wrap us up here because this has been a great conversation, but don't want to overrun the
Sure.
synthesis brains of our listeners.
I think it was well said, Scott. It made me think of when you say that specific applications, because in my analysis, in my how do I do this brain, a lot of time I like to think about that stuff. How can I apply this? And a long time ago, someone very wise and it said to me, work on catching people doing something right. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to that positive, finding the positive feedback and making it specific, and when we give specific positive feedback, what does that turn into? It turns into a repeatable thing. And so if you think about it that way, that's another one that's really great to apply is, try to catch people doing something right. I'll leave it with that.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thanks so much, Brooke, for joining us on this. It's been real fun, just a blast, really, to explore analysis and synthesis with you. I've learned a lot on this episode, and I'm going to try to be more improv oriented now that I understand what some of the rules might be. And for our listeners out there, definitely love to hear your thoughts on this. We are are trying to synthesize a lot of different touch points, whether they're with our customers, with you on the Insider Nation, with folks like Brooke, or even through as you could tell, some of the things that are happening in the broader landscape. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And also, where do you get breakthrough? What is the power of analysis or the power of synthesis, and what examples might you have? So drop us a line at engage@insidese.com. Also check out commercialratio.com. And, we look forward to hearing from you as you learned and really embrace this idea of orchestrating in the gap between strategy and tactics. Enjoy the white space out there, and we'll talk to you in the next one. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for joining us. To become an insider and amplify your journey, make sure you've subscribed to our show. If you have an idea for what Scott and Brian can cover in a future podcast, or have a story to share, please email them at engage@insidese.com. You can also connect with them online by going to insidese.com, following them on Twitter, or sending them a LinkedIn request.